My name is Ann Carlson. I'm the Shapiro Professor of Environmental Law at the UCLA School of Law, and I'm also the faculty co-director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, one of the co-sponsors of today's event, along with the University of California Office of the President. I wanted to just say a couple words about the origins of this event, and then introduce the esteemed chancellor of the Berkeley campus, who we're really honored to have with us today. So when the United States announced that it was pulling out of the Paris Agreement, you might remember that there was a strong reaction to the announcement, and part of that reaction was led by our governor, Jerry Brown, who pretty quickly decided that I think he was going to be the leader of states and other organizations committed to remaining in Paris and committed to trying to meet Paris goals. The United States goals, you might remember, are to cut domestic emissions 26 to 28% by 19, I'm a little backwards, by 2025. And part of the reaction also came from organizations, cities, universities, businesses, really around the country, who decided that we were not going to represent to the rest of the world that we were not interested in doing something about what many people believe to be the greatest existential crisis we face. And the organizations that are going to be on the podium today are part of those the organizations that are committed to really trying to exhibit climate leadership and to take responsibility for their own emissions. Some of the goals were actually set before we pulled out of Paris, but I think they become particularly important in the wake of a lack of action at the federal level. And so this event seemed like a perfect way to join with the governor, who of course is hosting this giant summit in San Francisco with lots of sponsored side events. This is one of them, to really showcase three organizations: the University of California, which has, as you will hear, set a very aggressive climate goal, Kaiser, and Microsoft. And so I really appreciate your attendance. It's great to see a full room here in this gorgeous space. And I want to thank Berkeley for hosting this event. It's really lovely. I also just want to give a shout out to one person, that is Daniel Melling, who works with the Emmett Institute, who has really done a yeoman's job from afar, organizing an event from Los Angeles and nevertheless getting all of this together. So thank you all for coming. And now I'd like to say a couple words about our honored guest, Chancellor Carol Christ. Am I saying it right? Yes. Okay, good. She is the 11th Chancellor of the University of California at Berkeley. She actually has a long history at Berkeley, even though she left for a while to go be the president of Smith College. She served as the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost of Berkeley twice, once on an interim basis when she came back. As I said, she served as president of Smith College. That was from 2002 to 2013. And before that, she was a professor of English here at Berkeley, and she is a specialist in Victorian literature, which maybe will give her some insights into how to solve the climate problem. She is an advocate for lots of important issues, including access to public higher education, a proponent of the broad values of liberal arts education and a science education. She's a champion of women's issues and a champion of diversity on college campuses. And she has a number of goals that she's already begun to implement since her return to Berkeley. Those include strengthening Berkeley's financial position, something that all the UCs have struggled with in the wake of the Great Recession, fostering community, improving the campus climate, and remaining strongly committed to free speech, an issue I think that has been really complicated for a lot of campuses to deal with. She's also working to try to address the campus housing shortage. And she's going to shepherd Berkeley through a lengthy strategic planning process in order to ensure that we'll remain one of the premier public institutions of higher education in the country. With that, I give you Chancellor Christ.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you so much for joining us today. I have the great honor of welcoming you to our campus and to today's Global Action Summit event. This week, the Bay Area is teeming with an assortment of thinkers, artists, activists, business leaders, policymakers, all of whom have come together to deepen a shared commitment to mitigating climate change. Through the Central Summit in San Francisco and affiliated events such as this one, we're celebrating the achievements of states, cities, and organizations in moving towards sustainability. And we're sharing resources and ideas that will help us do it even better in the future. Climate change is truly one of the great existential challenges of our time. And while it's troublingly ignored by some in the highest ranks of our federal government, I'm heartened to see such a groundswell of concern here in California, and action, not just concern. Today we'll hear from representatives from two companies, Kaiser Permanente and Microsoft, about how organizations set carbon neutrality goals and build sustainability into their operations. We'll also hear from a number of individuals from across the University of California, which itself has set a goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2025. The university has also committed to reducing energy use by 2% each year and has made an array of other commitments in the realms of green building, sustainable procurement, and minimizing waste. And incidentally, if you don't know, this is a zero waste building. Before we turn to those discussions, however, I'd like to share some thoughts about the more general role that higher education plays in the fight against climate change. The operational changes that we model on our campuses are, of course, essential, and our ambitious sustainability goals often spur other organizations into greater action. But aside from our own operations, institutions like UC have the means and the obligation to be international leaders in protecting the health of our planet through advancing our understanding of climate change and the ways in which humans affect the environment, leading the charge to conserve natural resources, spreading awareness of the choices we as a society can make to lessen our impact, and so much more. Let me quickly say that I'll illustrate my points here with a few examples from Berkeley's past and present, but I'm sure that UCLA and many other universities can offer similar anecdotes. To begin, colleges and universities are integral to understanding climate change. We have the knowledge and resources to conduct the interdisciplinary research necessary to identify the issues at play and to decipher them in all their complexity. Professors like the late Roger Revelle, an oceanographer and Berkeley alum who also helped create UC's San Diego campus, conducted some of the early research that led us first to identify human-caused global warming. Today we have professors like David Romps, whose simulation of clouds and atmospheric dynamics help refine our knowledge of climate change's effects, and the economist Solomon Shang, whose work with mathematical models helps us understand associated issues like the effect of global temperature change on economic growth and inequality. Many of you know that I recently inaugurated a strategic planning process to help us envision what our campus should look like in 10 years' time. And part of this includes identifying the challenges facing our state, our nation, and the world that Berkeley is uniquely suited to address through its teaching and research. It's becoming clear that one set of challenges in which we must be a global leader is the area of climate change, sustainability, and related issues of environmental justice. Aside from our research, colleges and universities are also hotbeds of engagement, I think particularly Berkeley. Ours is not an ivory tower, but a place where important ideas are intentionally carried far beyond the borders of our campus so that they lead to lasting change in the world. Just a few examples drawn from Berkeley's history. In 1892, our faculty were instrumental in working with John Muir to found the Sierra Club, which has for more than a century been among the nation's largest and most influential environmental organizations. Later on in the 20th century, Berkeley alumni played key roles in the establishment of America's national park system, in the preservation of Mount Diablo, and in the birth of the sustainable food movement. In 1961, 3 friends of the campus led Save the Bay, a local conservation effort that ultimately sparked some of our country's most important environmental protection laws. Institutions of higher education also have the ability to shape the destiny of our planet by educating future generations. I'm proud to say that Berkeley offers 560 sustainability-related undergraduate and graduate courses. At the very least, these classes help students understand what is at stake and instill within them a sustainability mindset. But often, I imagine, taking one of these courses puts a young person on the path toward becoming a climate scientist, a solar engineer, or an attorney for the EPA. Relatedly, students on college campuses embrace opportunities to educate themselves and each other about climate change. Over the last 30 years, Berkeley students have established 50 environmental student groups, taught hundreds of sustainability decals, those are student-taught courses, and through the Green Initiative Fund have supported more than 150 campus projects and 250 internships. Sometimes, in fact, I would say fairly often, it's the students who prod administrators into necessary action, as anyone who's familiar with an issue like fossil fuel divestment will know. But generally, as I said at the start of my remarks, colleges and universities are very good at practicing what they preach. Throughout our own history, Berkeley has instituted important changes on its campus to lessen our institution's environmental impact and to model sustainability in our operations. We established our first energy conservation office 40 years ago in 1978. Today, we strive to hit ambitious energy reduction targets, source renewable electricity, care for our trees and natural landscapes, use our procurement might to drive the sustainable products market, eliminate landfill waste and methane gases, build zero net energy buildings, and run our transportation on carbon-free fuels. None of this is to say that corporations like Microsoft and Kaiser do not also play very important roles in the complex fight against climate change. Building sustainability into business operations will be central towards solving this issue. And I'm eager to hear about how these companies have set and are progressing toward their goals. In closing, I encourage all the scholars in this room to recognize the responsibility they have to push for change in the world. I encourage the administrators and business leaders here to embrace the leadership roles our organizations have in spreading the gospel of sustainability. I think we can be even more bold in sharing our stories and solutions with the world. Now I'm going to turn over the floor to our esteemed panelists. Thoughtful solutions are required if we as a society are to change course on climate change, and I'm grateful we have the opportunity to learn from one another today. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I appreciate it. So I'm going to invite up the first panel who's going to join me here on the floor. For those of you that don't know me, hello, good evening. My name is Rachel Nava. I am the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for the University of California, and I'm also President Napolitano's Chief of Staff. And I have the esteemed pleasure of serving as the executive sponsor for UC's carbon neutrality efforts. So this is a project that is near and dear to my heart, and actually is one of the reasons why I wanted to take this job at UC several years ago, was the opportunity to work on UC's carbon neutrality efforts, because it's not only an important mission for the university, but the research and the science and the education that we are doing as an institution is important to California and the nation. So I'm very pleased to welcome our esteemed first panel, and I want to thank Chancellor Christ again for hosting us today at UC Berkeley and for her remarks. Our first panel is really here to talk about UC's carbon neutrality efforts, and specifically the work that we are doing that's translating both the research and scholarship of our faculty and students into actionable solutions that we can implement into our operations to achieve this bold goal of carbon neutrality. And as you would recognize, I would expect there are many obstacles to achieving carbon neutrality, and our hope in this panel is to lay those out, but also to talk about actionable solutions that we are all taking as an institution. So let me introduce our speakers for today. First up is David Phillips, who's our Associate Vice President of Energy and Sustainability at the Office of the President. He is essentially leading this effort for the university, and he's going to focus on the technical challenges that we're facing. Then we have Ann Carlson, who you already heard from, who is the Professor of Environmental Law at UCLA, and she's going to talk about administrative and financial barriers that the university has both identified and is working to address related to C&I. And then last but not least is Pallavi Sherakar, who is recently graduated from UC Berkeley and is now at graduate school at Yale and was very kind to join us. And she was integral at her time at Berkeley in helping advance our carbon neutrality efforts. And she's going to end our talk by talking about the latest steps towards implementation. So I think it'll be a good talk for sure. And I should advance the slide. There we go. So now you know who's on the table here. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about the university's carbon neutrality initiative and the history behind how we got to where we are today. And this work has really originated out of UC's own climate research. And that was the genesis for, I think, the commitment that we're making today. And I think there's two important faculty members, actually three, that are worth highlighting here. The first, as you are probably familiar, is Charles David Keeling, who comes from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego, and he was the one who first established the linkage between fossil fuel combustion and global climate change, and that was occurring due to greenhouse gases. And his work has really been the cornerstone of modern climate research and science. And the Keeling curve, if you're familiar, has really become a powerful symbol of the role that fossil fuels are playing in climate change. It's also worth noting two important professors from UC Irvine, Professor Sherwood Rowland and Mario Molina, are Nobel Prize winners for their pioneering efforts related to explaining how the ozone is formed and decomposes in the atmosphere. So this groundbreaking research has, I think, laid the groundwork for us in identifying what the problems are and what can the University of California do to address them. So once we really understood the threat that climate change posed, and as usual, and as the Chancellor referenced, our students were the rallying cry for the University of California to not only lead in science and research, but to literally take a hard look at our operations to see what is the University of California going to do about its carbon impacts. And so it really started in 2006 when we made a decision to implement our first climate policy, and you can see there the goals that were established in 2006. And then the 10 UC chancellors came together in 2007 and really made a formal commitment to make this a system-wide effort. That was then followed up by President Napolitano, who, when she joined the university in 2013, decided that this needed to be an important feature of all the work that we're doing collectively across the institution, and made it the Carbon Neutrality Initiative. And I think it's important to note that she actually launched the initiative at her very first Regents meeting. So this was a top priority of her agenda when she joined the institution. So as I've mentioned, a lot has happened since that first Regents meeting, and my colleagues here are going to walk you through where we are and where we're going. So I'd like to invite David to come up and walk you through it.
Yeah, so it's been almost 5 years since the carbon neutrality was kicked off. And just first to clarify the goal for UC to become carbon neutral is for our buildings and fleet. So that's what's included in the Carbon Neutrality Initiative. And this chart shows our historical emissions for the last few years. And you'll see there's a nice trend. We love, of course, trending data. And the blue dashed line shows kind of where that trend is heading. So we've made good progress, but it's not quite going where we want it to go. We need to bend that curve and take quicker action to achieve the goal, which is carbon neutrality by 2025. So how do we become carbon neutral? what we've done centrally is collect kind of the best ideas from all of the campuses. All of the campuses have developed climate action plans, and we've synthesized those, and we've developed kind of a strategic roadmap of how we become carbon neutral as a system. And the basic ideas are here. They're not necessarily always in this priority order, but the general idea is let's not make the problem worse as we grow. Let's do smart growth and minimize our emissions from new buildings. Let's reduce our existing emissions. Let's, for whatever's left, let's replace it with carbon neutral supplies. And then there's likely going to be some emissions that are left over, and in many cases we're going to likely have to take action off campus to mitigate those emissions. So that's the basic plan, and I'm going to go through some of the success stories in quick fashion here. So first, energy efficiency. This has really been a huge success for the University of California. Energy efficiency is one of the actions that all institutions can take that has multiple benefits. It's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but more importantly, in many people's minds, it's saving money. It's saving operational dollars. It's addressing deferred maintenance needs. In many cases, you're also improving the space as you upgrade systems. You can improve the quality of the lighting in spaces. So it's really a win-win-win. Thus far, the UC's campuses have completed over 1,000 energy efficiency projects. And the cumulative savings now is above 224 million. We're saving $30 million a year thanks to all of this work. As one example, many of our campuses have just really had dramatic cuts in their energy use, like 50% reductions in energy use since they've implemented these projects. This is an example from Davis that shows just the last few years. This is happening in a period of tremendous growth for the campuses. So the black line shows Davis's building growth over this time frame. The blue line shows the campus's total energy use. This is not adjusted for growth. This is total energy use. So you can see the campuses are growing, our energy use is going down. So this is really a huge success story for UC. Once we reduce energy use to the minimum we can, the next step is to start replacing it with carbon neutral. And the first place to do that is on campus by installing renewable energy generation. And we set an original policy goal of having 10 megawatts of generation on campuses. And you can see we're now, we've greatly exceeded that. We have about 50 megawatts installed, so it's a 5-time increase over our goal. And there's another 30 megawatts in planning. So even campuses that don't have a lot of solar resources like this one have found space for solar panels and are making good use of that space and producing clean energy on campus. And the results are starting to show. I pulled this yesterday. This is the results from the EPA's Green Power Partnership Program. Isn't it great to see the state of California and UC in the top 5 for on-campus generation? Mm-hmm. Pretty amazing. All of these numbers have increased a lot. Actually, I had an old slide and I was wondering, like, how did this change? And all of these numbers increased quite a bit over the last year. So it's going to be ongoing competition to keep us in this ranks, but we have plans to do so. Then off campus, once you've done as much as you can on campus, you can generate renewable electricity off campus. And UC has developed contracts and established contracts for the largest, at its time, solar PV system in the country for any university. This is one of 2 projects in the Central Valley we did. Altogether, they total about 600 acres of solar panels. So those are online for a couple years now. They're producing green power that we can then supply to the campuses directly through the wholesale power program. I'll tell you a little bit about that because it's kind of interesting. So UC, as part of this effort to become carbon neutral, we formed our own power company. So it's a pretty unusual thing for a university to do. But 7 of our campuses have certain kinds of accounts where you can select the energy separate from the wires. So you can be a PG&E customer, but you can have the University of California deliver the power. And so Cynthia in our audience here is one of the key players who's running that power program for us. And it's pretty crazy, you know, we're watching the market daily, we're buying power, we're trying to figure out, you know, where the market is heading, what the next project should be. So there's options for all of the campuses to participate in renewable energy through these kinds of efforts. So that's mainly good news. Now I'm going to talk about some of the big challenges. I'm here to, I was part of a team that studied one of the major challenges for the University of California. This was a project that was funded by the Tomcat Foundation and really was focused on one key issue, which was how do we transition from our reliance on natural gas? So across the UC system, about 2/3 of our emissions from our buildings come from the combustion of natural gas. So it's one of our major challenges across the system. And we made big investments in combined heat and power plants, like the one here at Berkeley. Those were really historical kind of, you know, cutting edge technologies when we made those investments. And it's really proven to be a very cost-effective way for us to deliver. At the time, that energy was cleaner than what we were getting from the market. And they're a tremendous asset to the campus in many ways. But they do operate on fossil fuels. And so the challenge is we've got that. We also have made such a big investment, and many of these plants are still in the early stages of their lives. They're 40-year investments, and it's not easy for us just to change course and pull those out and replace them with you know, the equivalent of renewable energy. So the Tomcat Foundation studied this issue, and it was a very great blend of both research faculty and operations folks. And that's one of the things I love about Carbon Neutrality Initiative, because it's tying these worlds together. And we brought them together in a series of meetings at UC Santa Barbara. And you know, the faculty started off with one position of, you know, whatever it was, that we need to just pull out all of the cogen plants. And then the cogen operator said, well, wait a minute. Do you realize, you know, it would cost us 5 times as much if we just bought that power? And after working through those issues, they reached consensus on a few issues. So they basically came up with 3 strategies for dealing with the natural gas challenge that we have across the UC system. One, they reconfirmed the need to do energy efficiency on the campuses and really accelerate that, and actually made the additional recommendation of taking those savings as part of the overall carbon neutrality initiative to help fund the aspects of the program that are maybe more expensive than business as usual. Second, they recommended and kind of confirmed our original strategy to use biogas as a bridging strategy for the university, and I've got some details on that I'll show you in a minute. And then the long-term solution is to move towards electrification. So as our assets reach end of life, or as we're faced with any decision, if there's a gas boiler that needs to be replaced, look at the latest technology and see if it does make sense to go with all electric options. And in many cases, it does. So the Tomcat group did a lot of analysis on the opportunities. They found that even though we've made tremendous savings, that potentially we could continue to cut our energy use by 30 or 40% more. So there's still lots of opportunities out there across our campuses. And they showed if that money were then reinvested into other programs, that would be sufficient to actually fund some of the options that are more expensive, like biogas. So the idea of making the circle large enough for carbon neutrality is a way of kind of proving that this does pencil out for our campuses. Biogas is viewed as a bridging strategy. It's essentially exactly the same from a chemistry basis as natural gas, but it's produced from these biological sources. So we've got landfills that are generating methane. In many cases, they're just burning the methane. So UC is making investments to collect that methane, clean it up, get rid of all of the water and the other pollutants, pressurize it, and then put it into the natural gas piping system. And that is a solution. Once you put it into the pipeline, there's a chain of custody that shows that then you can burn it at UCLA, and it's carbon neutral for that fraction of the supply. Electrification is really the longer-term solution. It shows that if you move to technologies like electric heat pumps, those are becoming increasingly cost-effective in many applications. As long as you're supplying it with renewable energy, electricity, those are carbon-neutral options. And when it comes to our buildings and the growth, we're building a great track record for showing how you can go with all-electric designs. This building there on the right is from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, just up the hill, is an all-electric new laboratory building. And we have examples of the latest housing project at UC Irvine is going all-electric. So that's increasingly a great option for our universities. So this is the big picture. This is what the Tomcat Group showed as the overall strategy. It shows decreased energy use on campuses. It shows the influx of renewable electricity from solar panels, from wind. It shows the biogas coming in as a supply source for the campuses. And then we've also got some things that are more cutting edge, like using hydrogen to generate hydrogen during periods where we have excess renewable electricity. That hydrogen can be stored and then put back into the system. It's effectively a way of storing the renewable energy and putting it back into the system. And we've done work at UC Irvine and other places that have proved that technology is working. So in my opinion, this is what the campus of the future looks like. It's going to take a lot of work for us to get here, but it's pretty exciting that we're on that path. So with that, I think that was the technical side of things. At the same time that this was going on, we had Ann Carlson working on the administrative and financial challenges, and she's going to talk now about those.
So before I talk about the administrative and financial challenges the UC system faces in implementing a very ambitious goal, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background about how I got involved in this process and what led to the creation of this task force. And also to remind people, or inform people if you don't know this, to think about just how complex an organization the UC system is. So not only do we obviously educate students, but we also have sophisticated scientific labs, we have numerous hospitals through the system, we have police forces on a number of campuses, we have elementary schools on some campuses, we obviously provide massive amount of housing, we feed thousands of people. If you just take the UCLA campus alone, there's something like 55,000 people on the campus when it's fully operational during the school year. So we operate mini cities, and the UC system as a whole has 10 of these mini cities. And so this is a big challenge, and it's a challenge that requires us to think about how to achieve carbon neutrality across a whole bunch of different systems that I think are really relevant, not just for other universities, but for companies, cities, et cetera. And so I really do think UC is an interesting model for thinking about this. So that's just the background. So I began working on this issue when President Napolitano appointed a task force. It's called the Global Climate Leadership Council, that was designed to give her input about how to think about the carbon neutrality initiative. And we met 3 or 4 times a year, and every meeting was at a different campus, which has been really fun and interesting to see all 10 campuses and experience the food. As you can tell, the campuses kind of compete for who serves the best food. I will tell you that UC Riverside is way up there for me because they grow a lot of their own food on campus. They're an ag campus. But all of them have really put on great shows for us. But one of the things that became clear during these meetings is that we would hear from various staff on campus, on the various campuses that were responsible for buildings, sustainability, and so forth. And I started to notice that there was a disconnect between the campuses and the goal. And let me give you 2 examples. One example was a campus that has a cogeneration plant. You just heard a lot about the cogen plants from Dave. And one of the campuses was thinking about expanding their cogen facility. We have a carbon neutrality goal that we're supposed to meet by 2025. which is not very far from now. It may sound far, but it's, it's what, 7 years from now. This was about 2 years ago. And it was clear that the people making decisions about whether to expand the cogeneration plant were not thinking at all about the fact that we had a carbon neutrality goal that we were supposed to achieve in the next decade. Another example was some staff who were involved with new construction projects on campus, and they came and gave us a presentation. And what they said a few things that were really striking. One was that there are many campus priorities, no big surprise, but whether carbon neutrality is at the top of that list when you've got lots of pressure to expand housing for students, we have lots of pressure to take additional students, new labs that need to open and so forth, that it's not always clear that campus leadership is prioritizing carbon neutrality or providing the necessary staff and financial incentives to actually make that happen. And so I started raising questions about this. At the same time, another task force member was raising questions about whether we should create a carbon price or a carbon tax or something on campus to try to incentivize behavioral change. And because no good deed goes unpunished, I got asked to chair this task force, which we call the Carbon Neutrality Finance and Management Task Force. And I worked very closely with Dave and Pallavi and Mark Fisher, who's in the room, a number of people, the other people in the room who I see who did a lot of great work for us to try to really examine how do we actually get the campuses to carbon neutrality by 2025. One of the things that's interesting about thinking about these goals is it's really easy to establish them. And it's a really different question about whether you can actually meet them. And I think we really started, when you see that, that slide that Dave showed with the very gradually tapering off emissions, it would be 2045 if we went about business as usual. If we're going to get to the 2025 goal, we need to make some really dramatic changes. And so that's what our task force looked at. I will say that it was a pretty extraordinary effort that included surveying lots of stakeholders on campuses, getting sustainability officers involved, getting construction staff involved, really trying to figure out what drives decision-making, what do we need to change in order to make this happen. And so I'll give you a sense for some of our recommendations. We have a very lengthy report on the Office of the President website, and we also, some of you I saw picked up, we did a kind of short version of it out of the Emmett Institute at UCLA that gives you some background information. Let me see if I can figure out how to make this work. There we go. So these are may seem kind of banal, but they turn out to be super important. So one is that you can't achieve carbon neutrality on 10 UC campuses unless the leaders of those campuses buy into the goal. Seems obvious, but 3 years into the goal, it wasn't clear that all the campuses were doing that. And so part of what we recommended is we need to really up our communications efforts. We need to make clear that this is a priority. We need to think about individual campus needs and what's realistic in the face of budget pressure, again, increasing student enrollment, all sorts of demands on the campus, and really figure out how to work with the campuses to make clear that this is a priority, but to make sure that it works within their operations. And then the other thing is interesting within a university system. So I'm a scholar of federalism, the relationship between states and the federal government. And so I think I came to believe that the University of California is really a system of federalism. So the Office of the President is the president, and the campuses are the states, and the states sometimes like what the president tells them what to do, and sometimes they resist it, and sometimes think they should get to go their own way, all the kinds of battles that we see played out between the federal government and states in our federal system. And it became really clear through the process, in part because we had a really sophisticated and interesting group of administrators, faculty, students on the task force, that we really needed to respect campus autonomy in making our recommendations. One thing that was really clear is we could not impose really stringent mandates from the top. Another just kind of seemingly obvious thing, but is worth thinking about, is that if the Office of the President says, we'll give you money to do this, well, that money comes from the campuses. So it's not like the campuses are aching to have the system give them money, because that just gets collected from the campuses through a kind of tax for the Office of the President. And so we had to be very careful on the kinds of recommendations we made with those kind of two conclusions in mind. We ended up making a series of recommendations. I will say there were two things that we carved out. One you've already heard about, which was the Tomcat Natural Gas Task Force that took a look separately at the cogeneration plants, because they really do pose, in some respects, I think, our most challenging obstacles to achieving carbon neutrality because we've invested so much money in them and because they have long lives, and there's no great replacement for natural gas. And then we also had, Tomcat also funded a group that just put out a report on improving our communications with faculty, students, staff, campuses, et cetera, again, to try to address that first conclusion that we really need buy-in in order to achieve the goal. So putting those two things aside, because other groups address that, we made a series of recommendations. These are some of our biggest. One is how to fund and finance investments to achieve carbon neutrality. We don't do a great job of, for example, taking the savings from investments in things like energy efficiency and plowing it back into other investments that can then reduce carbon. And so one of our recommendations was to try to, and again, these are recommendations, they're not mandates to the campus, but to try to get campuses thinking about how they structure their finances so that they can see a direct connection between savings on campus and then reinvestments to reduce carbon. Dave already talked about the relationship between energy efficiency and conservation and reduction in reliance on the cogen plants, but independent of that, it's clear that we can invest even more in energy efficiency. Dave talked about 30 to 40% savings that we are not yet accomplishing that we could. One of the most interesting things is the way in which UC Irvine in particular has done an incredible job reducing its energy usage in labs, which are big energy basically hogs, and trying to, and the process where they've gotten scientists to buy into first upgrading the labs and then realizing that you can use a lot less energy by taking care of things like the circulation of air in the labs and so forth. So another part of the energy efficiency puzzle, though, is that you can't just install these systems and not have staff who know how to maintain and operate them. Again, seems like common sense, but if you're thinking about how do you actually accomplish carbon neutrality and you don't have enough staff in place to figure out the complexity of these systems, then they're not going to do you much good 10 years down the road after they've been installed. And so we made some recommendations about appropriate staffing levels to maintain the buildings. Dave also talked about the procurement of renewable energy and the way in which we're doing that. Lots of progress on that front already, and we'll say a bit more about it later. New buildings are a real issue, right? So we build new buildings, and if they're not carbon neutral, then they add to our footprint. And again, we have a lot of pressure to house students and to have new classrooms and upgrade labs and all sorts of things. And so we've made recommendations about not only the design of new buildings, but also providing for kind of an offset program so that if you do have a building that can't be carbon neutral, hospitals provide particularly complex challenges, then you could offset your increases in carbon by projects elsewhere on campus, by redoing a lab, for example, and reducing the energy usage. We did a lot with medical centers, which really, and we have a representative from Kaiser who's going to talk about the complexity of reducing carbon footprints in hospitals and in medical operations more generally. So we made a series of recommendations about medical centers that was led by the CEO of one of the UCLA hospitals who's been working really closely with the other UC hospitals. And then finally, we made recommendations about communication and change management, although again, we punted most of that to a different group that has done a bunch of focus work with various groups on campuses and so forth to try to figure out how to up the visibility and the buy-in of the carbon neutrality initiative. So those are our recommendations. So here's another obvious point, but one that often doesn't happen, at least among academics. We're really good at writing reports. And then those reports often just sit on a shelf and no one really does anything with them. One of the great things about the University of California that I've really come to appreciate through this process is that there's incredibly talented senior administrators who actually make things happen and who are doing so now. So one of the great things about my experience on this task force is that the report is actually now being used as a document to actually implement the changes that we recommended. And Dave's team leads that, but we also have people like Mark Fisher on the Berkeley campus who is helping to implement a lot of these. Nareet Katz, who's in the back of the room, our Chief Sustainability Officer at UCLA is here. So the campuses are really integral in this, and it turns out that's That's kind of key. You can make all the recommendations you want, but if there aren't people who are actually following up on those. And then one of the feedback mechanisms we have is that Dave and his team report back to the Global Climate Leadership Council about the progress that they're making on all of these various goals. Oops, I went the wrong way. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is a checklist of the recommendations that we made and the status of the progress that we're making on these recommendations, just to illustrate the ways in which what we said should happen actually is happening on the ground. And I can take virtually no credit for this. I helped author the report, and then I go back to my law world at UCLA, and Dave's team takes over, and they've done a fantastic job already. So you can see, you can read some of these. There's a long list of them, works in progress versus what's actually on track. And then we do have a couple of reds. I'm sorry to say we'll get there, but I'll let you take a look at these first. And if people have questions about any of these, we're happy to address them maybe after, or if we have a few minutes for questions and answers. Here's a couple more. So, these are about new buildings and what we do in the medical center, and how we actually try to take into account life cycle costs of buildings in the design phase, so that you're not just looking at the upfront costs, but you're also looking at the savings of the buildings, et cetera. And then these are two that have been tougher to get campuses to buy into, but maybe we'll get there down the road. But when I said the kind of financing issues are complex, they have remained complex. No campus so far has adopted an internal carbon charge, and we have not yet had a campus integrate their utilities and carbon management as a standalone financial unit, where again you'd plow savings back into new programs and so forth. Maybe we'll get a campus to bite, but so far that remains a work in progress. So I will stop there and just say that again that the people I've worked with on this task force have been extraordinary, and one of the most important participants for us was Pallavi. I'm not going to say your last name right, Shalakar, who was our student representative and who was just extraordinary. I think we all, I think it's safe to say, just have incredible respect for her and a lot of affection for her as well, so much so that we flew her back from New Haven so that she would come join us for one more meeting. So with that, Pallavi, if you could come describe the student experience.
All right, thank you so much, Anne. And it's so wonderful being here with you all and being back on the Berkeley campus. Berkeley is my second home, so it's great to be back. So I get the pleasure of talking to you a little bit about some of the highlights of things that are coming up that are going to get UC closer to our carbon neutrality goal. So the first, and one of the most important, in my opinion, is the Bonnie Reese Carbon Neutrality Initiative Fellowship for students. This includes graduate students and undergraduate students, and they're picked from all across the UC system, so all 10 campuses, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources, and Office of the President. So for the 1 year that these students serve in that fellowship, they work on things like climate action planning, resilience planning, energy efficiency and data systems, student engagement, coalition building, really a broad swath of climate protection efforts. And one of the really nicest parts about this fellowship is it really allows students to kind of get out of the bubble of being a single campus and remember that the University of California is a system of 10 different campuses. And so thankfully it has been funded every year since. Let's see if I get this right. Perfect. I'd also like to tell you about our online carbon reduction pledge campaign. It was called the Cool Campus Challenge. It launched in 2015, and the platform was developed by UC Berkeley's Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. And essentially what it is it's an online platform where participants, whether they're students, staff, faculty, administrators, can log in and pledge to take an action that's going to reduce their individual carbon footprint. And I think no pun intended, but what's cool about the Cool Campus Challenge is that in a span of just a few weeks, we had 19,000 participants across the system. And that's so important when you're dealing with goals like carbon neutrality or issues like climate change that are nebulous and difficult to really understand. And having a platform that is accessible and really brings more people into this initiative is so critical for building support for climate action in general. And on to even bigger news. I am so happy to announce that UC has really taken some major steps in updating its sustainable practices policy. And all of these updates were in line with what CalPERG students were advocating for. For those of you who don't know, CalPERG is the student advocacy arm of the University of California. And so the first is that the UC has pledged to reduce its energy use by 2% on average every year. And that data will be available in every January report, that the annual sustainability practices report that's released in January. Second, it has solidified its commitment to using biogas as a bridging strategy to move away from natural gas. So biomethane from landfills and digesters will make up about 40% of the fuel used in these facilities by 2025. And equally important, UC has also committed to moving away from fossil fuels in all of its new buildings. And so no new building will have a gas boiler in it. And finally, UC has also announced that by 2025, it will procure 100% clean electricity. This is in line with Senate Bill 100 that Governor Brown just signed into law, but the deadline is 20 years earlier than the state. This is really exciting, and this is something that CalPERG students in particular have been so instrumental in advocating for at the UC system level, but also at the state level. In fact, I wanted to share with you a short quote by one of the chairpersons of the CalPERG campaign. She's a student at UC San Diego. Her name's Sophie Haddad, and she said that, "Today, I'm proud to be a UC student, proud that the university is taking visionary action, and proud that my generation was able to come together to advocate for a future powered by clean energy." So I just want to end by reflecting a little bit on what Sophie's saying. For my generation and for generations that are younger than me, things like the heat waves across California, the wildfires across the West Coast, the storm that's about to hit the Carolinas, those are glimpses into a future that we don't accept. And action and climate action, as Chancellor Christ was saying, is particularly useful at the UC level, or at the university level, I should say. Universities are at the front lines of a lot of groundbreaking knowledge and research. They're also there are the grounds for new generations to learn and to continue to foster their growth. So I'd like to think about it less as this is an opportunity for universities to take bold leadership, and rather this is a necessity for universities to take bold leadership. And with that, I'll pass it back to Rachel Nava.
So we have just a few more minutes left to take any questions from the group, and I believe we may have a mic that circulates. So I want to thank the panel, first of all, for your presentations, and happy to take any questions from the floor. We heard a lot today. Right there. If you can stand up, she'll bring you the mic.
Hi, I was wondering how one of the UCs that you mentioned got labs to participate heavily in energy efficiency projects. It's something that I struggle with at UCSF.
So I'll try to answer this question. Dave may have a little more information than I do, but on the UC Irvine campus is a champion of energy efficiency. And there was also a chancellor, who's now the chancellor of Ohio State, who was very, very committed to reducing energy usage on campus. And I think they got an initial lab which was very, very skeptical to be the guinea pig. And I think what they started to realize is once they upgraded and invested in energy efficiency, they actually could provide at least the same quality services, if not better, using significantly less energy. But he will tell you it was a struggle. It was not easy to get the scientists to buy in. I think it remains a struggle on a number of campuses. You are not alone in struggling at UCSF. Dave, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think the other thing that Wendell stresses trying to find co-benefits from doing the project of if you're making the lab safer at the same time, because a lot of the existing ventilation standards are really not about safety. So as part of what they did at Irvine, they installed monitoring devices in there that are actually measuring the air quality and adjusting the ventilation accordingly. So I think that's part of the strategy. But a lot of these techniques, they can happen in a lot of different ways. You have some campuses, if you have really great top-down leadership who's passionate about it, that's effective. But you can also have it happen if you have really strong energy managers who can work up. And so I've seen both of those solutions be effective across the UC system.
Wendell is a great proselytizer, so getting him on your campus is actually not a bad way to start to get. I mean, it's really impressive what they've done, and so just hearing, he's fantastic about it, and it might be helpful, and he's very willing to travel for these things.
And for those of you who are wondering who Wendell is, it's Wendell Braze, who's the Associate Chancellor and Chief Sustainability Officer at UC Irvine, who chairs with me the Global Climate Leadership Council. Any other questions from the group?
I don't need a mic, I don't think. I just had a question about how you're accounting for this.
I think they're recording, so they would love to hear the question. Thank you.
Sure. I had a question about how you account for the cogen electricity output within the renewable electricity goal. Is that considered to be renewable electricity once it's on biogas and therefore you're not replacing it, or how exactly is that working out?
Yeah, that's essentially how it works. Is the greenhouse gas reporting is based on how much natural gas you're burning and how the energy, basically the emissions factor for the electricity that you're purchasing. So if you use 50% biogas on a cogen plant, that effectively cuts those emissions in half. So that's the standard practice.
I think there was one more question in the back.
Sorry.
There's follow-up. Okay, of
just to
course.
follow up. So is the goal to by 2025 be using 100% biogas?
It really isn't. It's the current goal is 40%. That we potentially could go up to 50%, and it's really kind of campus options. If that doesn't happen, then we're moving into off-campus actions or offsets, and there's a lot of work going on to sort that out. What a UC approved offset project, one that's additional and meets all of our standards, and hopefully advances our mission at the same time. Barbara High is one of our leading researchers on that subject, and she's helping to advance.
And I noted the carbon offsets as one of the options toward the bottom of the pyramid there. But I guess the other thing that I didn't hear, and it occurred to me as you were talking through it, is have you considered selling that electricity and increasing the offsite renewable purchasing to make up for that? Now that you have a power company, can that higher carbon electricity be sold off to somebody else?
Whatever Cynthia says, we'll do. But yeah, I mean, we're trying to be very pragmatic about it. So we are going to sell, for instance, some of our early biogas because it's got a high value. We're planning to sell some of that into the market as a way of helping to finance the rest of the project. And if we have any circumstance where we could do a large solar project on campus or do something else like that would make money for us and reduce emissions, we're all about that.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question there in the back.
So I remember these are all spectacular goals, and I do remember early on business travel being carved out as particularly intransigent, and goes to the offset question. So beyond the question of where the offsets are there any examples yet of us as researchers or the university being allowed to build offset charges into grants, into revenue generation, so that we're actually saying this is part of our business model, we have to include that in the cost of doing business?
Doreen Katz, I see raising a hand. So, she's the one to talk to, but UCLA has really done some great pioneering work where they've built a charge into the reimbursement process for air travel so that they can use those funds then to take action on campus to further reduce their emissions. So it's the starting point. It's a really great program. So Norit's the one to talk with. More questions?
All right. Well, I think we are at the end of time, and we do have one more panel of esteemed speakers. But if you would join me in thanking my colleagues for this great presentation. Thank you.
So you heard kind of in detail about the university's carbon neutrality plans. This second panel is going to focus really on implementation, and we're going to have each of the panelists give a little bit of discussion about their journey to carbon neutrality, and then we've got some questions that we're going to ask all of them to get into the details. So allow me to do brief introductions. At my far left is Mark Fisher. He's the Vice Chancellor for Administration here at UC Berkeley. He's got a very interesting history in that he's actually worked at 3 UC campuses. He spent most of his career at UC Santa Barbara, but he also was at UCLA. So he can, I don't know which campus you're going to talk about today. Maybe all 3 of them. That's great. So he's going to talk about the challenge of actually implementing carbon neutrality on the ground at a UC campus. Next, we have Seth Baruch, who is the National Director for Energy and Utilities at Kaiser Permanente. And Kaiser Permanente has tried to one-up us and set goals that have even a tighter deadline than ours. So we applaud that. We've invited, both Kaiser and Microsoft have been participants in our Global Climate Leadership Council, and so we've got a great partnership with them. And to my left is Elizabeth Wilmot, who's with, your title is the Carbon Program Lead for Microsoft. And of course, you've probably heard about the wonderful things Microsoft is doing. She's going to talk about that in some detail. So, and I think we'll start with you to talk about your journey to carbon neutrality and maybe what's been different from what you heard about from UC. And,
sure, absolutely, great. So thanks again for including me here. It's wonderful to be here. Elizabeth Wilmot, and I lead the carbon program at Microsoft. And I joined Microsoft just about 2 years ago from a decade in the public sector and in the nonprofit sector working on climate change, where I had wonderful colleagues, a lot of really committed professionals, but I had personally gotten frustrated at the pace of change. And so I looked to the private sector and to Microsoft, and particularly the tech sector, where I saw a lot going on and a lot of change being accelerated. And so when I joined about 2 years ago, I actually knew that Microsoft had a carbon tax. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. Microsoft, this company has an internal carbon price. What is that? What's that about? And so I'll tell you a little bit about that tonight. So rewind back to 2010, 2011, Microsoft had a sustainability team, and they got out their crystal ball and they said, we know that the cloud business is increasing as a percentage of our bottom line. So all of the big data, the big compute that we need to hold our Facebook posts and our deep data PhD analyses and all the work that all the heavy data work that large commercial enterprises do, and so that's all held in large data centers around the world. And we said, we know that needs a lot of energy and water to run. And so we made a decision to be carbon neutral, to commit to carbon neutrality. And there's a lot that goes into the definition of that, of course, and we can talk more about that. We looked to a close partnership with Natural Capital Partners, who at the time were the authors of and still are the authors of the Carbon Neutral Protocol. And we made a commitment in 2012 to be carbon neutral. We met it that year, and we did so through energy efficiency, renewable electricity, and carbon offsets. And the way we funded that was through this internal carbon price that I alluded to. And what's been exciting to me about that is that as we've evolved that program, we've looked beyond the borders of our 4 walls. And we've looked increasingly to how our technology can help enable customers, whether it be NGOs or universities or governments or large commercial enterprises, to make change in their own contexts. And so, for example, just last year, we launched a $50 million program, $50 million over 5 years, to put AI, to put artificial intelligence in the hands of environmental researchers, again, at NGOs, universities, local governments, federal governments, to help accelerate change to help accelerate their work. And so it brought me back, when we launched that project, it really brought me back to my time as a researcher and a nonprofit consultant at a small 20-person nonprofit out of Seattle, where I was crunching numbers on greenhouse gas inventories for the cities of Puget Sound. And in this tool suite, AI for Earth, we have tools, not exactly that would help the me of 5 years ago, but people like me and people like all of you to really take those big, rich data sets, help to solve big societal problems, societal environmental problems, especially focused on climate change, to really drive change. And so as our carbon neutrality program has evolved, it's really looked beyond just carbon neutral operations to help look at how we can help society as a whole. So that's maybe a longer introduction than you had anticipated, but I'm happy to talk about any other questions as we go.
That's perfect. Seth, I know you have a lot of big news to give to this audience today. So
sure, I'll get to that. So thank you very much for inviting me here today. So I'm Seth Baruch, National Director for Energy Utilities for Kaiser Permanente. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, know who Kaiser is. Some of you maybe even be Kaiser members. But for just to get this out of the way, so Kaiser Permanente is one of the largest integrated healthcare providers in the U.S. We have about 39 hospitals, most of which are in California, as well as hundreds and hundreds of other medical office buildings, administrative centers, call centers, data centers, not like Microsoft data centers, but smaller data centers, and 12 million members. So we have had this commitment. I've been at Kaiser for about 3 years. This carbon neutral by 2020 commitment was announced just about around the time I arrived. It had nothing to do with me. But it really stems from the realization at every level within the company that climate change is directly affecting the health of our members. You can see it in heat-related stress, vector-borne diseases, asthma-related diseases. These are all really affecting both the health of our members and the communities in which we serve. So it would seem only logical that Kaiser Permanente should do what it can in order to reduce our carbon footprint. And as someone in the last panel alluded to, it's easy to make goals. It's harder to achieve them, and we're certainly now in the throes of dealing with those challenges. But the senior leadership of the company made the goal, and then it was sort of up to our team within our group in corporate to come up with a way to engage our stakeholders in order to develop the strategy to achieve that goal. And so we're in 8 regions. I mean, California is our biggest, but we're also in Hawaii and Colorado and a few places in the East Coast. And each one of those regions has a Sustainable Resource Officer, or an SRO, with their own group of stakeholders. So we brought all those SROs together. David, you were at that event a couple of years ago when we laid out all the different options to get to carbon neutrality. We had a very interactive exchange and process to whittle down the options to the ones that we've selected and that we're working on executing right now. So as David mentioned, we do have some news today. So we did announce one of our one of the first legs of the stool in order to get to carbon neutrality is to eliminate our Scope 2 emissions through the combination of on-site and off-site renewable energy procurement. And so we just announced a deal with NextEra, a virtual power purchase agreement for 180 or so megawatts of utility-scale wind and solar to be built in California. The wind farm is just over the border, actually. It will be just over the border in Arizona. This is new renewable construction that's will be online probably by around 2021, which more than doubles our existing 153 megawatts that we have built and that went online in 2015 and 2016. Both wind and solar. The wind project actually is right over in the Altamont Pass, so you can see it as you drive on toward Yosemite. And then we have a couple other initiatives which I'll get into, including green tariff, a utility scale, or I guess partnering with utilities to build renewable energy facilities on our behalf in regulated markets where we can't own and operate directly through a wholesale power market like you can in California. And then the third part of the initiative is carbon offsets, which I can get into when we talk about barriers and challenges, because that's we haven't executed in that part yet. But that is sort of a very high-level overview of the program. I know that I think it was Ann mentioned the challenges with sort of more of a federal structure. You know, when I talk to folks at UC, the similarities with Kaiser are often pretty interesting because we have the same situation, except it's really not like the U.S. Constitution. It's more like the Articles of Confederation, where the regions and the service areas and the facilities have their own P&L. They kind of really operate on their own. Our group within Kaiser is, again, sort of financed through a tax. And so it's a lot of give and take with all of our internal and external stakeholders. And so that is, again, part of the challenges that we face, which I can get more into. But anyway, that's just a quick sketch of what we're doing.
Great. 160 megawatts. Cynthia's got her work cut out for her.
So Mark Fisher, Vice Chancellor for Administration here at the Cal campus, and prior to that, Vice Chancellor for Administration at UC Santa Barbara, and prior to that, Campus Architect at UCLA. By training, I'm a landscape architect and architect, and I've been involved with the greening of the UC since really 2003, but in about 2000, my Vice Chancellor at UCLA had a discussion about the state mandate that all state buildings should be sustainably designed. And he said, oh, we're really not going to deal with that. And I thought, that's interesting. And so, moving from that point to the place where we are today, where we're really rethinking how we build the UC campuses, how we think about energy, we've come an extraordinarily long way over that period of time. Along the way, a lot of people were naysayers in terms of, could we do this? Would it work for the UC? What would this take? And I would say some of the people who were skeptics at the beginning have become part of the choir. And I won't name names, but anyway, after this, I'll tell you who those folks might be. And we've made a huge transition from that place to today. And I think that it's been an amazing progress and journey to get to this point. So for me personally, I'm committed to change. I love the built environment, thinking about how it can be used to help solve this issue. As we were going through the carbon neutrality initiative, and we started thinking about where we could make changes in the process, the thing that stood out to me was let's really change how we build buildings going forward. We can't really bend the curve unless we stop building energy or carbon producing buildings that don't move in that direction. And I think one of the great steps forward was changing our policies, which I think was last week. And we now have our green building policy or sustainability policy basically moves us toward electrification for all new buildings. This is a sea change. Like all of these steps in the process, there are folks who've said we can't afford to do that. This isn't the right thing. It's too quick. We're moving in this direction too expeditiously. And I would say we can't really get there unless we make bold moves, and we've been able to make those bold moves. And I think that every time we've made one of these changes, we've actually stepped up and done it. So the UCs have stacks and stacks of LEED certified buildings. I think this one's slated for LEED Platinum, maybe. And we just made a huge leap forward in terms of these efforts and getting to a point where we really can reduce the amount of carbon that we're producing and putting in the atmosphere. So that's my journey.
That's great. Maybe we'll ask you now to name, maybe you can start, Seth, with one key barrier and solution that you can share with the audience to get us towards carbon neutrality, get yourself towards carbon neutrality.
Sure. So I mentioned before we're having to work with our stakeholders. One of the things I manage is our on-site solar program. And so that requires, obviously, if we're putting carport solar arrays on Kaiser properties, the cooperation of a lot of people. Administrators, facility engineers, that is, and now we've gotten about, I think we're now at like 30 plus different sites, and we're probably going to do another 30 or so. So that's a complex undertaking, and some folks are more supportive than others. In general, once the, so I guess this is a barrier and a solution, once we work closely with these local people, once we introduce them to the vendors who are actually implementing the projects, they tend to be much more supportive when they see the sort of the non-environmental benefits of solar projects, particularly shading and very hot parking lots. We tend to get a greater willingness to handle the disruption, and there is a lot of disruption, obviously, with ripping up parking lots, especially during cold and flu season. So stakeholder management and cooperation is certainly one of the key challenges. The other one really is, and I'll list this also under a barrier and a solution, is cost. So like the UC system, Kaiser, we're not a for-profit corporation. We don't have lots of money to throw at these kinds of things. So the key mantra is affordability, affordability, affordability. Every dollar paid for operational expenses is somehow reflected one way or the other in health premiums that our members pay. So if we're going to be spending millions of dollars on carbon offsets or something else, that's a big decision to make. And there's a lot of people that need to be on board with making that decision. Fortunately, and this is kind of where it gets to the solution part, the price of renewable energy has come down so much, and the price of electricity in California is high enough that we actually can model, even in this era where all of the peak demand times are shifting to the non-solar hours, that we can actually save money by doing on-site solar. We are seeing, and this is just an interesting anecdote, we are now doing these community renewable energy programs in these regulated markets where we actually have to work with utilities. Puget Sound Electric in Washington is one, Xcel in Colorado is another, where we're seeing the ability to subscribe to these community renewable energy projects run by utilities at a price that's at or below what we're currently paying. So we're actually able to get to our Scope 2 emission goals, which is about 2/3 of our total emissions, cost effectively, which is great. I don't know if that would have been the case 3 or 4 years ago. And with the ability to add storage to both our on-site and off-site projects, that just furthers both the resiliency angle, which is important for our medical facilities, as well as being able to optimize the economics of our solar assets by being able to discharge, charge batteries when solar is glutting the grid and discharge these batteries when the sun goes down. So I guess 2 key barriers and key solutions.
That's great. Thanks. Elizabeth?
Great. Yeah. Well, the number one barrier really was, how do we fund our program? And we came up with the idea of doing an internal carbon price, charging our business groups for their electricity consumption, their on-site emissions due to natural gas consumption, and their business air travel. And when we sold it to them, not everyone was persuaded, right? We said, come along with us. If it doesn't work, we can get rid of it. Come along with us, come along with us. And it was this sort of spirit of experimentation. And over time, many of these business groups have been converted because they see the brand, the brand leadership of carbon neutrality. They see, in some cases, the cost savings from energy efficiency and renewable electricity investments. And they see that it's the right thing to do and that our customers and investors like it. To the extent that even some groups are interested in going further and possibly looking at our Scope 3 emissions. And so that's a conversation we're having now. And I would also say that another barrier that we've faced is really a very good barrier. I think it's a from my perspective as a longtime climate activist, it's a great barrier to have, which is the healthy critique of carbon neutrality, of how did you achieve carbon neutrality in a given year with all these other organizations that have these long time horizons, and how did you define carbon neutrality? And I think what's been interesting about that to me is a real embrace internally to do better and do more and keep refining how we think about this program and keep trying to make more and more material impact, both in terms of greening the grid, in terms of the types of carbon offsets that we invest in, the large sustainability, the large scale sustainability impact we have from those investments. So in the course of the past 6 years, we've actually set metrics for ourselves that continue to refine those goals. So we've set a goal for our data center team that has since expanded portfolio-wide to be 50% directly renewably powered by 2018, which we met this past year, and 60% by 2020. And for a company of Microsoft's size with a data center footprint that's growing, it's very easy to talk about those numbers and very hard to execute on those. So I'm really proud of our team for digging into that. I would also say that last year at the climate conference in Bonn, the COP23, we announced that our carbon neutrality commitment would mean that we're on path to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions 75% by 2030 relative to a 2013 base year. So we turned that carbon neutrality statement into carbon math that would add up in widgets or in tons that people would understand, and really I think again just continue to show that we want to have a material impact not only on our own emissions but outside our four walls.
That's great. Mark, you.
Okay, so I think this will work. Yeah. I'll take that one. So the Berkeley campus. So just sitting here, I can see from this spot a number of the areas of endeavor that are challenging for us. So one is aging infrastructure. So there are buildings like Worcester Hall, which is not everyone's favorite, although some of us like brutalism. And it has single pane glass windows and probably not the most airtight envelope. To the left is the Haas Business School, which is a newer building, quite nice, but it doesn't have air conditioning. And with climate change and increasing temperatures, we're starting to get calls from the campus to air condition our buildings. So moving in a direction of adding actually more cooling demand to the campus, we have some, I think, issues in front of us about how do we address that? How do we address the immediacy of temperature change in buildings that are not comfortable anymore, whether they were built differently or they just were built in a period where maybe the weather was cooler and more predictable. On top of that, we have an energy plant that's quite old. We have 50-year-old boilers on the campus. We produce about 80% of our electricity burning natural gas. If you walk the campus and walk across a lot of the grills on campus, you'll find excess heat coming out. So we're losing energy every day on the campus. The steam system is antiquated. We've looked at a decentralized plant, which we think is the right way to go, but we don't know whether that plant is natural gas fired, which is the benefit of pretty cheap electricity, or do we go to an electrification project where we start to buy all the electricity for the campus? Much more expensive. And our friends down the bay on the other side have done something like that, but they have a lot more money available for these sorts of projects. Resources are an issue for all of us, obviously. So we're looking at creative solutions for that. We're looking at something called social equity funds, where you find some sort of angel investors who will invest in perhaps the electrification of the Berkeley campus, with the idea that this might be scalable, that for those publics that don't have the benefit of the privates, we might be able to raise money so that we can afford to do this like they've done it, but do it in a very different way. I'm not a specialist in this by any means, but the basic idea is these social equity investors will basically look favorably on how you pay off the debt. So it's not as driven by profit, it's more idealistic investing. So hopefully Berkeley can be a leader in this, and I hope I didn't give away our big idea, but hopefully we can do something like this and really move this campus into a position where it is a leader again in terms of energy use on the campus and really moving away from fossil fuels. And then along with that, everything from solar arrays, thinking about where we might place them. Obviously, we have a lot of beautiful historic buildings. They don't necessarily lend themselves to solar arrays, but we have a lot of buildings like this one and Worcester again with flat roofs, and really looking at how we can optimize those building rooftops in a PPA type model. We have a little bit of that today, not anywhere near as much as I'd like to see, and we have properties out at Richmond where we think we have also the opportunity to use some of the big roofs some of which are shared by like the Northern Regional Library, that we think might benefit this campus too in terms of generating clean energy. Our colleagues at the UC, OP are working with us right now to try to get into that, be able to purchase utilities through, I always get this wrong, it's not bundled, it's
Direct access.
direct access, thank you. And this would really help this campus because it would allow us to move into that portfolio and away from PG&E, just as a detail. So we produce about 80 to 90%, Sally will correct me, of our energy on campus. The last 10 to 20% runs about 33 cents a kilowatt hour. This is more than I remember the cost of electricity in Hawaii, for example. So it really behooves us to pick low-hanging fruit. So one of the challenges and one of the benefits is we haven't picked as much of it as we could. We have a lot of lighting initiatives we can take advantage of. We can rework our mechanical systems to our advantage. And I think we can do a lot of smart things here in the very short term to reduce our demand, pull down that cost. The campus has been generous in allowing us to keep our energy budget. It's not been formalized quite like that statement earlier, but it's basically working the same way. And we're plowing that back into energy saving projects, whether that be staff or investment in energy projects again. So I think a lot of good things are happening now on the campus, and I foresee a lot more happening in the near future. So.
Why don't you keep it? Well, Ann wanted to know from each of you what you found most surprising about this journey.
Oh, boy, that's a good question. I think the fact that we've been able to do it, frankly, and every time we get to one of these hurdles, the naysayers will say, this doesn't work, or it's not worth the investment, and we have many other priorities. And we always have dealt with that somehow. And even the 2025 goal, we've all struggled with how quick this is. The students have struggled with the notion that we're going to buy offsets, and do they like the offsets? And I think one of our coming challenges is how do we buy offsets that our student population will approve of? And I think they should have to approve of them and agree that those are good investments. I think we'll do that. I think we've made, again, huge progress to date, and amazingly, we've absorbed a lot of new policies and directions in a way that I think has greatly improved the UC. So. I think it's
great to hear.
I guess I would say the biggest surprise is that we've been able to get as far as we've gotten without actually having any real substantial cost impact. That may be ending. We were talking about in terms of carbon offsets, we're having the same discussion here, Kaiser, in terms of what is an acceptable offset, what is acceptable to all of our stakeholders. But so far, we have been able to procure, again, the bulk of our effort so far has been on our Scope 2 electricity-related emissions, where the offsets will handle the Scope 1 at or below what we've currently been paying for electricity. So that's been really great. And the prices that we were seeing for the utility scale renewable energy projects that we were in this most recent RFP that we issued, compared to just 3 years ago when we did the first, or 4 years ago, I guess, when the first RFP went out. The prices have gone down so much. Everyone talks about how much the prices have gone down, but they really have gone down a lot. And the fact that we can be looking at and having a conversation about procuring renewable energy right off the bat that's lower than we're paying in a lot of the states where we operate is very encouraging. That was a surprise for me.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Yeah.
I was smiling to hear you guys talk about the what surprised you, because what surprised me is how excited people are. How excited people are. Our executives of this major multinational corporation and our employees who are software engineers, who I wouldn't think would really, give a rip about this. They are so excited about this work when they find out about it. And often I don't think we actually do a good enough job about communicating about it internally. We probably do more. I think there are probably more people outside the company who know about it than in. But the other thing that I was smiling about is I actually totally surprised myself at how much I love our carbon offset program, because I cannot underline enough how much of a curmudgeon I was about offsets when I first started, and how much of to the extent that even when I prepped for my interview for my job, I had all these notes in the margins about, are we really carbon neutral? Are we, is that just diluting? And in fact, I've been really converted about that. I'll be frank, because carbon offsets are necessary to meet the global carbon budget we need to stay within 2 degrees or less Celsius. And really, the Nature Conservancy, for example, just last year published a report that said that 37% of the emissions reductions we need to achieve to stay within 2 degrees come from natural climate solutions, come from the original technology of trees, and so, or sensitive ecosystems such as peat bogs or mangroves, or go down the list. And so, to me, frankly, as a tree hugger and someone who is easily persuaded by pictures of charismatic megafauna, just really cute large animals, I'm often I just think that these projects can be really fantastic. And I know that not all entities have the same boundaries that we do. I mean, because we are a global company, we feel okay about, and because we're doing so voluntarily in context of a large, robust portfolio of carbon reduction actions, we feel okay about investing in projects that protect swaths of rainforest in Indonesia. We feel really, because they're super high quality, high integrity, we feel good about investing in projects that develop, that reforest parts of Virginia or the Netherlands or Ireland. We feel good about that from a conservation standpoint. So I know that that's easy for us to say, and it's harder when you're an entity with a tight boundary. But I would just say, I would just ask, don't close your mind to that. Keep your mind open to offsets.
That's great. Why don't we open it up? We can close with a couple questions from the audience. Does anyone have any burning questions for this panelist? I see one in the back there. I think I recognize that face. Who's good? There it is.
Question for Elizabeth Wilmot. In your internal carbon tax, who pays whom if everybody's Microsoft? And is there any friction with that?
Great question. No, excellent question. So each year I'll tell you, it's just at a high level, step by step. Each year my team does a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 being our on-site emissions, Scope 2 being electricity-related emissions, and Scope 3 being upstream, downstream, so our supply chain, business travel, et cetera. And so when we assemble that inventory, we assign the different emissions. We look at where those emissions are coming from within the company, and then we simply charge. Our team charges the business groups. It is primarily our data center teams, actually, even within the company. They're the largest. Generators, and so consumers. And so we then assign a price per ton based on the budget we need to achieve carbon neutrality in the coming year, based on renewable energy prices, offset prices, et cetera. And then we apply that price to the respective business group's footprint. We assemble the funds each year. It's a negotiation every spring. It's sort of, there's not a lot of brinksmanship, except in sort of my mind that likes to over dramatize things. And it's actually a really great process, because in fact, it's an opportunity to educate the business groups about what we've done with that money over the course of a given year. And it's an opportunity to get them to think about climate change in context of their own business strategies. And so we then assemble that money. We then spend it over the course of the following year on renewable energy, on carbon offsets, on energy efficiency, not necessarily in that order, and on our program management. And so, and we save some money actually for technology innovation as well. So that's actually what I mentioned before as funding AI, the AI for Earth program that I mentioned. And so although, yes, the business groups are paying into us, I think they also see, most of them, most of the time, see the business value as well.
Any other questions? Well, this has been a great discussion. So I think we'll thank the panel now and bring Ann back on stage to close us out. So thank you for being here. Thank you so much.
So first, let me just again thank you all for coming. You were a terrific audience, and thanks for staying till the end and enjoying the drinks and food. I thought I'd offer a couple of personal observations that came to me as I was sitting and listening to the second panel. The first echoes something that I think Mark said, and that is that I think I was one of the skeptics about the 2025 carbon neutrality goal for the UC system. I have said this before. And one of the reasons I was skeptical is it seemed really, really ambitious and really, really hard and way ahead of the state of California, which is in and of itself a climate leader. And I've really come around to believe that it was the right thing to do. And one of the reasons I believe that it was the right thing to do is because it's completely refocused our decision making. So if we had a 2040, 2050 goal for reducing carbon emissions to zero and we were making decisions about new buildings on campus today, I don't think we'd think for a moment about whether they were carbon generating or not. And now we do, and we have a new policy in place. We are making long-term capital investments that will have a huge impact on what we emit. And so we really have had to rethink how we do business. And I think what Mark said is we think we can't do it, and then it turns out we can. And the ambition of the goal has really, I think, changed our own ambitions internally on campuses, and I think that's really important. I think the other observation I would make is that, I started out on kind of a downer by noting that the United States had, announced that it was going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And if you do what I do professionally, and that is think about climate change all day, you can just really get really, really depressed, right? And Pallavi talked about the hurricane that's about to hit the southeast and the wildfires that have plagued our state like we've never seen before, and heat waves. And you can hear a lot about how hard it's going to be to get to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. Those are temperatures that scientists think we really need to achieve in order to stabilize our climate. But today is a hopeful day, and I think what we heard from the panelists is a lot of leadership, a lot of creativity, a lot of pushing boundaries and envelopes, a lot of leadership from people like Pallavi, who we need because it's her generation that's going to really experience these impacts on the ground. And you heard her passion, and she was channeling the passion of a lot of students. And so I just want to leave with a hopeful note that we have a lot of creative, smart people invested in trying to figure out how to solve a very, very hard problem. And just because the federal government has abdicated responsibility doesn't mean that the rest of us can't step up and take the lead. And so I am just heartened to see all the good people in the room who are doing really terrific work and really working to make our planet continue to make our planet a hospitable place. So thank you again. I hope for those of you who are participating in the summit across the Bay, enjoy the next few days and learn a lot from the various side events. I will say that we have another one tomorrow that UCLA is sponsoring on making megacities sustainable. If you are interested in attending that, you can look on the Emmett Institute's website for information. And enjoy the evening, and thank you again for coming. Appreciate it.